All right, it is 9:30 on the dot. This is the first meeting of the week, so I'm going to give a couple of minutes for people to find the rooms because everybody's probably still lost in figuring out where we are. And we actually have a 2-hour slot, and I requested an hour and a half, so I think we probably have the time to wait a few minutes. I like our QR code slide has an error on it. It's probably CrowdStrike. All right. Why don't we go ahead and get started? So this is the Secure Asset Transfer Protocol Working Group. I am one of your chairs, Wes Hardiker. Claire is remote, and we will say hi, Claire. There's Claire. She wasn't able to make it this time, but Dublin's going to be closer. You're going to make it in Dublin, right? Excellent. Okay. As a reminder, all IETF meetings are subject to the note well. If you're not sure what this is, you should consult the lawyer for your company. But as a large part, it says that when you contribute to the IETF, verbally or in any way, you are sort of bound by some legal requirements. There's a number of things that you can read to help you understand this, including some best current practices on the Internet Standards Process and how the IETF works, how working group works, our anti-harassment policy, our code of conduct, how we deal with copyrights and patents and participation and things like that. And of course, we have a privacy policy as well. In general, our code of conduct guidelines we adhere to strictly. We treat colleagues with respect. We speak slowly and limit the use of slang. We dispute ideas by reasoned arguments, not by ad hominem attacks, which I can never pronounce. We use engineering judgment. Our first and primary goal is to make things that work. We find best solutions for the whole internet, not just corners or segments of the internet. And we contribute to ongoing work of the group and the IETF as a whole. Please bear in mind that everything in IETF meetings are recorded. That includes microphones, it includes the cameras, and it includes also the chat client. So things that you say in the chat client are also recorded for archiving purposes. This will all be shared on YouTube later, so you can send YouTube links to your friends and family watching what you've been doing this week. As I mentioned, it is recorded. When you come into the room, and whether you're online or in the room, you do need to sign in. So for the people in the room, the way we record stuff and the way we handle queue management of who's going to talk, there's a online tool you can use on your phone if you scan the QR code, or in the agenda, there is a on-site tool that looks actually not like the one that's on the picture, but the recording button on the left is actually the full desktop client that allows you, it has the chat client and it has everything else, but most importantly, it has the raise hand tool. And we do work through a queue based on that, not based on who's actually standing at the microphone. So we call people according to who's in the tool, not who's standing in the room. Generally, keep your audio and video off when you're remote until you are actually going to speak because you're in the queue or presenting. And here's all of our working group information. I'm sure most of you know this already, but we have a data tracker page all about the protocol. And our purpose is, to develop a protocol to transfer digital assets between two different networks. We have a very limited charter at the time being that really includes the 3 drafts at the bottom, which is a core protocol document, an architecture document, and a use cases of how we expect this protocol to be used. At some point in the not too distant future, we will probably recharter with new items as these become, about done. There's other things we know people want to work upon in future consideration. Today, PDF tab damage is always horrible. Today we are, we'll go through some things, the chairs are going to go through stuff, which is what I'm doing now. We're going to talk about the architecture, and Thomas is going to talk about both the SATP architecture and the SATP core documents. And then Rama is going to talk about the SATP use cases, and then Dennis will have some updates on stage 0. So the way we always organize our meetings are the core documents always get first priority, and then the stage 0 is sort of some preliminary discussions about what's happening that really occurs before the protocol actually takes over. And that's certainly one of the bounds for future work, but it's not technically in our charter today, but we have plenty of time to discuss it. And it has actually affected stuff. Our scope, as I mentioned, we have this notion of asset networks that have a network 1 on one side and network 2 on another. We are not standardizing anything that happens within the networks. We expect 2 gateways to sit on the edge, and we are really talking about the protocol between those 2 gateways. Wherever possible. Obviously, there's interactions that happen in networks that we have to consider, but we are not standardizing them in any way. And there's different types of networks that may exist. Our esteemed area director, Ori, raise your hand. He is the area director for the whole area that we are sitting in. And he requested that we review our SATP milestones because guess what? They're due today. And we haven't succeeded in that. And don't worry, no IETF manages to ever get their milestones done on time. But it is time to reevaluate and figure out, okay, if we're going to adjust the dates, what are we going to set those, to be? So in the beginning, we actually promised the use case document to finish first. And actually that's received, so many various bits of input and suggestions that it's trailing behind a little bit because everybody's been concentrating on the architecture and the asset protocol documents. I'm especially curious for the authors of all 3 documents, where do we want to reset the dates to? I think that the architecture and the protocol documents are really close, maybe 6 more months or so. Thomas is nodding his head, who is one of the primary authors of both. And then if Rama has thoughts of how long it'll take to, answer for the use case document, my thinking is a year, that one still has a little bit more work to be done. But thoughts from the people contributing to that would be highly helpful, say now. Go ahead, Rama.
Yeah, I think we have a good collection of use cases which cover all of the scenarios that we wanted to showcase as compelling for the architecture that we've laid out in the architecture document, and also many of those scenarios have direct application of the SATP core protocol. Some of the scenarios present examples which need protocols that are not even covered by the SATP charter yet, but which we hopefully will cover at some future date, because those are necessary for 2 networks to interoperate and share assets with each other. So I think we are in pretty good shape with the use cases. The only question is whether the community feels that that the use cases are compelling, and or whether we need use cases drawn from other fields besides the ones that are highlighted in the document. Maybe we can get into that when I'm presenting.
I'm actually having a hard time hearing you because the echoing in sitting in the chair room, the speakers are faced away from me. But what I didn't hear is, what I don't think I heard was actually a time. Can you give an estimate of how much time you need, in terms of years, into how long it'll take to sort of wrap up everything you just said?
Well, I think the document is ready for review right now. Thomas
Okay,
and I had a brief chat a few weeks ago, and we thought it could be put out. We thought the architecture document needed to be accepted first, though. So
okay,
sometime this year, I would say. Yeah.
okay, great. So if I put down a year, does that seems safe? I realize we might get it done faster, and that's fine.
That's very safe. Yeah.
So, Ori, go ahead. Our esteemed area director is going to answer all questions.
I, Ori Steele, responsible area director for SATP. Usually the milestones are targeting the date at which you would deliver the document to me as responsible AD, and then if assuming everything's going well, I'll bring it forth to the IESG. So I would think about like finishing your document, your working group activity should be completed by the date that you set in the data tracker. And I can do early area director reviews if you want. But usually I will like take a look at the document at that point when you send it to me. That's it.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, so it's getting through working group last call, being done with it and saying we're ready to deliver it. And then it'll go through a lengthy IETF-wide last call where a bunch of people that had not ever read the document before will review it and then tell us we were all wrong. Of course, kidding. But we get lots more feedback from the entire rest of the community as well as the IESG as they review it, as well as a bunch of directorate reviews. I did request a couple of early directorate reviews. So you saw a review from the security directorate, and the HTTP directorate actually gave us a review a year and a half ago before the document was even off the ground very much. But they like to look at anything that's especially HTTP based protocols. So. All right, so I will put probably January 2024 for the first two and July 2024 for the second, just to give us a little more room because it hasn't gone through quite as much working group last review. That being said, we may beat that, and that would be fantastic. And then at some point, we'll work with Ori on rechartering. And so what that really means is the working group will need to have a discussion of what's next, right? And I think that there's a number of things that the working group has considered, including the stage zero, which we'll talk about a little bit before, and the bootstrapping, as well as I know bidirectional, transfers have been thought about and things like that. So, but we'll have that discussion probably, my guess would be November. I'll work with Claire on the right timing for that, but it depends on when the other stuff gets wrapped up. All right, anything else for working group preparation? And we'll dive into the real meat of today's meeting. I see no hands or other things, so thank you very much. And then, yeah, Thomas, you can come up here wherever you want to go. Let me share your slides. Yeah, I can drive the slides. Well, there is a remote. I didn't seem to get it working, and I knew there was a trick to that, and I failed to do that ahead of time. That's the wrong share. Slide share. Architecture updates. We're doing architecture first, right?
Yep. Okay, let me.
So I don't think that'll work. Nope. Okay, I'll do it.
Okay. So updates, basically 3 groups of updates. This is clear demarcation of stage 1 from stage 0, update to the figure, and then this whole discussion about context ID. So next slide. Okay, so previously, if you saw architecture maybe 2 revs ago, you'll see in stage 1, there was all this back and forth negotiation, identity. Here's my originator, identity. Here's my beneficiary ID and all that stuff. It's like, hang on, that really shouldn't be part of the core protocol. So that got moved up, which is in stage 0, which is going to be future work. And so if you look at what we have today, basically, actually, if you can move it one slide, probably nicer to see a picture. Yeah. So this is stage 1. So basically, the first message is saying, look, we've had all these complex verifications in stage 0. This is the set of parameters. This is the pointer to the asset ID. This is the set. So basically message 1.1 is essentially confirming, here's what we agreed in stage 0, right? And so in message 1.2, gateway 2 can say yes, yeah, perfect, we're aligned perfectly on everything. And then, however, there's always an out. So gateway 2 can say, you know what, for some reason it's not on a board, for some reason I don't want to proceed. So there's always an opportunity in 1.2 for gateway 2 to say no, proceed for policy reasons, whatever reason, terminate gracefully. It's not on a board, right? This is the important thing. Now, if both sides decide to proceed, then this is where really the handshake starts. So transfer commence and act commence. And in 1.2, the transfer proposal receipt is actually a signature on all the stuff that was agreed upon previously that's being replayed in 1.1. Here's what we agree upon. Yes, this is the set of stuff. So it's really just, the receipt is literally, yes, yes, I agree. And we've had discussions about why this is necessary because of the whole sort of range of legal questions. So that's the demarcation. Next slide.
Trying to take notes at the same time, so give me a little time break. I know, Ori's on it. Thank you very much, Ori.
Actually, you know what? Keep on going, because this is just verbatim what I just said. Okay, so next item, updating the figure. So a long time ago, we actually had something like this where the application could talk to the DLT, the network, as a client, submitting some kind of a, anything from, a token, a transaction, or whatever. And then the other option is for the application to talk directly to the gateway itself, literally through an API. And we're going to talk about the APIs in a little bit. And so this is useful. And thank you, Dennis, for pointing this out, bringing us back to the original figure. This provides us with interesting use cases such as this views. So for those who don't expect people to have read the views draft, but the idea in views is that an entity or the beneficiary in network 2 is needing information about the state of the asset in network 1, and it's a private closed network. So there needs to be a cryptographic mechanism to do this. That's the views draft, future work. But what happens there is really the beneficiary needs to ask gateway 2 to ask gateway 1 for the views, right? So it's a direct, the request is coming from user 2, the beneficiary, directly to its own gateway. So this is one use case of the need for an application to talk to what I say the box, even though how we define the box is outside of our scope. What we're trying to do later on in the future is define the APIs for each of these interactions. The API that we're dealing with now is what we call API 2, but for this direct connection between an application to the gateway, it is API 1, just for those who are interested. Yeah, Paul has a question.
Paul?
Paul Hoffman. I'm very concerned about the architecture changing now for something that is a draft that's not even adopted yet in the working group.
Adding the arrow, the extra arrow?
Well, it's not just adding the arrow. It is, in fact, an additional API that hasn't been specified. When I see this, so to some extent, you're right, it is adding the arrow. When I see that a client now has two ways of talking to two very different objects, that seems to me to be significant architectural difference, and we don't know how that's going to happen later. So is that really an appropriate thing to do in the architecture now, or to when the other document is adopted to then change the architecture?
So in the core document, which is the next presentation, it's actually there written API 1, API 2, API 3. The discussion about APIs have been moved to the appendix. So
Okay.
we've been this is why it was a correction. In fact, we've always looked at it this way. This diagram got dropped off for some reason. It was Dennis who about 2 months ago said, you know what?
We are
Core is
actually
doing this,
already
but
doing
your
it.
architecture is not showing it.
Fine. Sorry,
And if you look- yeah,
I missed
yeah,
that. I
yeah.
thought this was an architectural change, not a
No, no, yeah.
bringing up to date.
So
Thank you.
if you do the diff between V5 and V4 draft, you'll see just one diagram. That's
No,
it.
I understand that, but it sounded like from what you were saying, in fact, this was a change to the architecture. It's just a bringing the architecture in line with the
That's
core.
right.
Okay, thank you.
So one, if I may, one clarity of some history of the working group is there was a lot of stuff that I think people have interest in working on here, but the negotiation with the IESG to get this off the ground was we minimize our work into sort of the core protocol between the two gateways, but there are requirements that the core protocol will impose upon implementations in, within a network. So, one of the things discussed a lot was possibly the legal ramifications of what we expect these two networks to, actually have some sort of a legal agreement, so that it falls back to the court system or something when transactions fail or things like that. Or we require that a network have the ability for a gateway to lock an asset. We don't describe how, right? We don't say, you must use an HTTP-based, REST-based API. We just say there should be some sort of, some sort of API with these requirements in order for, the security to be sort of backed up in between. So we're trying to slice it into different groups where right now we're only talking between the two networks, but there are ramifications of how that ripples out into other parts of the architecture. So it has made it very tricky how we sticked with our chartered requirements without stepping over those bounds and yet still impose some requirements. And that in the IETF, we often come back and maybe need to make some changes in the future. Hopefully we won't have to do that, but that happens occasionally. Yeah.
That's right. Yep.
But thank you for your point, Paul.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, good point. Next slide.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Okay, context ID. So for a long time, we've had context ID and session ID listed in the core spec without actually saying what context ID was. Session ID, we said from the beginning, well, that's a session sort of numbering, unique number, maybe it's a random number that is only shared between gateway 1 and gateway 2, and for simplicity, gateway 1 chooses it. And this is the same way that, if you look at older protocol, IKE v1, IKE v2, one side chooses a random number and it's discarded, forget it after the session terminates. But there's this bigger question that in stage 0, the thing that kickstarts SATP are assumed to be a couple of applications. And so there are cases, as we've discussed in the group, where there's this existing context ID thing that's floating even before SATP kicks in, and somehow you need to bind this down to that instance. So this is, by the way, how context ID is derived. It's still out of scope, but this is kind of a sort of a direct pointer to what's going to be, in the future. So I think I have a diagram. Thank you. So this is kind of, people say, why do we need context ID? Well, for those who are familiar with the European Union, MICA regulation on the different assets, I've used that as an example here. So the originator is trying to transfer over 2 related assets. One is an ART compliant asset reference token. You could Google that. And the other one is EMT, electronic money tokens. Doesn't matter what it is. But this is part of a single transfer at the application level. And this goes to what Anthony was talking about, settlement. Okay, this gets interesting. So how do you bring this together and say, look, both need to occur to make the whole thing legit, right? So the legit question is out of scope. But for us here, we need a context ID that persists across sessions and is independent of the session ID.
Can I restate that
Yes,
and you
please.
tell me if I got it right? So there is a notion where the two entities need to know that these things are sort of part of a common set. But the important thing is that in terms of our charter is right now, if one succeeds and the other failures, we can't do anything about it because that's out of scope of the current charter, and we'll figure out how to bind them together later.
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
Right. So just bit of background. What's context ID? This is very high level. We're not saying how to compute it, how to derive it, how do you communicate it to the gateways. I think next slide, there's a pointer to, okay, so it's in core. If you look at one of our documents, there's already, Dennis, you can put that on the chat. There's already a link to some early thoughts about what this needs to be. And I think in some of a couple of the previous interim meetings, Dennis has had a diagram that all this stuff going from application 1, application 2 to application 1, context ID is pushed down to the gateways, and then SATP kicks in, right? But all of this is stage 0, which is what is going to be future topic, during the rechartering. Any question? This is highly simplified diagram, so
Ori?
Hi, Ori Steele. I've heard the rechartering, constantly, and I just want to, advise you all, like, be careful showing in meetings stuff that is only going to be possible to really get into any deeper discussion after some rechartering process, because it can create a lot of discussion around the details of items which you're not going to be able to do anything about. And that's going to make it difficult for me to help you when your documents do come through, if they have lots of connection points to, oh, in the next charter, oh, this piece errors. So be careful as you add that kind of information to documents. Sometimes it's better to say nothing.
Yeah, thank you, Ori. It's definitely been a challenge because, being able to put a field in there to be able to use later, we hit that a lot because of the grandiose plans of the larger picture.
So the work session ID, context ID has always been in core, draft core, the next slide. We made it mandatory recently. Session ID has always been mandatory, it has to work. But previously, context ID was optional. We're now saying it's mandatory. How you compute it, out of scope.
Okay. Liang?
Hello, it's Frank Xia, Huawei. Just two simple questions. First one, this working group called the Secure Asset Transport Protocol. I want to know how the secure means here. I don't see very clear the secure properties for this protocol right now. Can you give me a very short description? And secondly, this is because I'm the new, sorry. Because so this is mainly application layer protocol, right? Because I don't see any network protocol layer things here. So just the two simple questions. Yeah.
Yeah. So the first one, secure. So although not shown, the TLS is assumed to run between the gateways, and secure in this sense means that it's the commitment level. So once you finish this is essentially the two-phase commit, actually two and a half phase commit. So the 3-phase, but with one arrow removed. It's a 3-phase commit protocol that guarantees, that the assets are going to be, the networks are going to be consistent. To your second question, yeah, this is why it was in the art area. I think originally we went first to security area, and this is same, almost verbatim. So, but anyway, the name stuck, so we kind of, we kept the name, but it is in the art, director.
Okay, maybe I can talk to you offline, more details. Thank you.
And if you have questions on the chat, there's all these people on the chat that, caffeinated, ready to answer you. Okay, so move on. No questions. Next draft, which is.
Well, so let's stop here for 1 sec before we shift topics. So from the working group requirements point of view, what do you see as left that needs to be wrapped up before we turn it over to the AESG? So there was sort of some last call comments from participants of the working group. I think a lot of those have been handled.
Yeah.
There is some of the directorate reviews and things like that. Can you speak to where we are in terms of following up on all of that so that we can wrap it up?
Yeah, so I think we want to follow up on some of the comments. I think Hillary had a particular comment I have yet to answer, but we want to bring that to the mailing list. But just reviewing it quickly, I don't think there's any significant sort of changes to the architecture spec. It's more like explain it, but why are you doing this? But anyway.
So expanding on a few descriptions,
expanding.
right? Okay. All right, that sounds good. All right, and then you're ready to shift, so we
Okay.
will do so. And slides.
Okay, so this is core, which is the actual protocol itself. Move on. So as before, we when we decided, well, all the stage 0 negotiations needed to be out before stage 1. Same thing now in core. In fact, I think we fixed core first and only realized later on, oh, we haven't updated the architecture. Just move the entire subsection up. So actually, next slide, please, Wes. So for those who are new to this and you're wondering like, what is this guy talking about? Stage 0, stage. So the yellow that you see here is out of scope for us, right? It's actually quite complex. So in fact, for example, identity management, this is a big issue now with so at the global financial level, there's this Financial Action Task Force headquartered in Vienna that basically regulates all the international wire transfers. It does this, anti-money laundering and so on and so on. And they haven't figured out, particularly with blockchains coming out of the picture, how do I verify, so Hannah says he's got a public key on, Ethereum. How do I know that, right? So this problem is actually in many ways beyond the IETF itself because it involves people at the legal level, at the national level, right? So this is an example. One thing that the group has been talking about is the asset type. So again, some of us have been discussing, well, is there a way to not just enumerate or create a taxonomy of assets, but where's the metadata that tells me, well, this asset class is a, basket of oils, commodities, and so on. That particular asset is, artwork, right? There is no sort of schema that defines this. And so we're trying to actually define a schema so that at least there's some mechanism to capture the metadata information in a consistent syntax, right? Because why is that needed? Well, because stage 0 will need it, to do this. The other thing shown here is the gateway operator. So I presume, gateways are run by somebody. It's not just an anonymous sort of thing. It could be that, a bank could be a gateway operator. In the banking space, I think there's the BIC number. Anthony knows about this, the big number, which is used by banks to identify the endpoints, identifier for the endpoints. So all of this is stage 0 for those who are wondering. Stage 1, our sort of mandate in the charter is just the rest of it, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. Right. So this is this diagram. Next slide. So for a long time, we had the words API type 1, API type 2, and API type 3. And things got confusing when we started, when Weijie Zhang, joined the group and started talking about network addresses, because we started talking about address type 1, address type 2, address type 3, and people got confused with the word type. So we dropped it for the API. So now we're just calling it API 1, API 2, API 3, just so that when we talk amongst, with each other, we know we mean the API. So API 2 is the gateway. This is SATCore deals with API 2. API 1 and 3 are today out of scope. We have to say something about that. That's at the bottom. And this is why we have Ori saying, no, no, no. So we might have to fix that in core, just call it API. And we don't know it's API 2. That's why we need your help. Ori, tell us what to say and what not to say. Currently out of scope. So yeah. Okay, next slide. Okay, so context ideas. So this is some thoughts. Okay, why have we gotten here? So a while back when we were talking about identifying gateways, the question came, well, a gateway operator could actually stand up a service that was front-ending two different networks, right? Same API, two different networks. And so how do I know that I want that network, not this other network? More interestingly, for those who wanted the gory detail, when Ethereum, the creators of Ethereum created Ethereum, they enumerated the net, testnet, and so on in a very trivial identifier structure. And so after the fork, for those who know the fork history, there was a case where when you do a cross-network transfer into the Ethereum network, there could be a probability that, probably not zero, that your transaction ends up in the wrong fork, right? Why? Because so there was no mechanism to actually designate that fork versus that fork. Now, internally, those who are interested, the Ethereum EEA Alliance, Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, has published an interop document where they actually define the network address to include the Genesis block. That's the only way for you to get assurance that the identifier was so it's in the draft. It's draft Zhang. It's expired, but it's there if you want to look at it. We have to update that. Why am I mentioning this network identification? Is when you want to identify an asset token on a network, on a blockchain, you have to also include the network identifier. It's not enough to say hash. Here's a hash of a record. Here's a hash of a block. Well, great, but how do I know which network this is on? And even worse, what if it's a private network, right? So for those who don't know, the design of SATP has always assumed private networks on both sides as the worst case scenario, because if you can solve for that, you can solve for public networks. That's if you're wondering why. So this is a transfer contact ID. I don't think I have any more slides. Can you? Thank you.
I think there's one more.
One more?
It's probably questions, right?
Okay. Yeah. So that was the last slide. If you're wondering, this is, and so the question we haven't started a discussion. This should be on the mailing list. If you have a transfer context ID, does the context ID include the network, physical all the way another physical network identifier where the asset resides? So we need to sort of discuss that. Anyway, that's the end of my.
Okay. Any questions for Thomas on the presentation to date? And I'm going to ask him the same questions I asked him a minute ago. Paul?
Paul Hoffman, and I have not been following the discussions. I've mostly just been reading the documents in preparation for this morning. I'm assuming the working group intends to move both core and architecture forward at exactly the same time. That is, they seem intricately linked, and if architecture goes before core, there's a bunch of dangling stuff coming out to core. If core goes first, there's a bunch of unstated things that are in the architecture, especially what's going to be considered long-term out of scope. Is that?
That is an excellent question. I will say that we had not considered binding them, but they've been progressing at the same time, and they're both nearly ready at the same time. So the questions I was going to ask Thomas in a minute is, what's left, and it's often the same authors. So I think your point is valid, that in some ways it's helpful to be bound. At the same time, when they go through IETF and directorate reviews, we may find one slowing down, and if we want to keep them in line. So I think what I will do, Paul, is Claire and I will work with Ori on what he thinks about that situation as well, unless Ori wants to speak to it today.
I'm just thinking as someone who might be asked, like during IETF last call, can you please review this one document? That would suck, because I wouldn't know. Not only are there bindings between the two, they're not stated. I just heard some of them this morning. They're like they're verbal. They're not stated in the document, like in core saying you need to understand this thing about architecture where it's said to be out of scope. I would hope that you would push the two together. I mean, in an optimal world, they would have been one document now, because they're so intertwined. I understand why it's not, and it's certainly too late to suggest that. but a reviewer of one of the two documents would have a really hard time.
Understood. Thank you very much. Cross-dependency normative references doesn't sound like a bad thing to me.
I think the architecture is mentioned in the normative section of core. And if it's not typo, we've always assumed, you know. Yeah. Yeah. No, but Paul, absolutely right. Reading one
not
without
just
the other.
mentioned, but I mean, there are many places in core, it seems like,
Okay.
where there is a thing that is assumed that you understand from the architecture.
Okay, no, good point. I think we could
And
definitely.
even if you send the two of them out together, someone's going to review one, you know, like someone will review one of the two and then say, this is unclear, whereas it's not unclear to you. It's just that there wasn't a pointer.
Yeah.
I believe you'll end up with a lot more pointers, which is fine.
Yeah.
I'm just saying if you send them off separately, that's going to probably become unmanageable for you.
Good point. Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
so AI for me, for our editors, yeah, add sufficient pointers in core back to architecture. We kind of assume that you would read the architecture first and then read core, but you're right. I kind of assume that. We kind of assume that. So
Probably state that.
state that. Okay.
Rama?
Yeah, I see between the two documents, there's a dependency in the core document of the architecture document. That's the core document refers to the architecture, but it's not the other way around, right, Thomas? And that's what I've been seeing. Also, when the architecture document was written, it was meant to have a broader scope than what is strictly needed for the SATP core protocol. So if you read the architecture document, it defines a particular set of modules. It defines a modular architecture that is used for interoperability between any two systems that are maintaining digital assets. And you see there are some different kinds of interoperability modes that are talked about there. And the SATP core protocol is meant to implement one particular type of interoperability, which is the transfer or the burning of an asset in one system and its recreation in another system happening in an atomic manner. But the architecture document itself has a broader scope, I think. So I see a one-way dependency, but I have no problem if the community thinks that we should be releasing the two at the same time.
Yes. Right now, there's a one-way dependency. We were thinking architecture would finish first, but so we didn't point it to core. But and right now, the way we read is pretty much done. It's more the real work now is in core, and core has always pointed to architecture, even though we probably should say that kind of verbally in text. Read this first. It's okay, right, to say that readers should read architecture first before reading core. I think that's a okay line to put in a spec.
Yeah, that's essentially the normative reference, which means you cannot understand this document without having read these others first, or properly understand at least, since everybody often just reads it without reading all the normative documents, but they should, and that's the point. So, okay, then let me turn to the same questions of what is left, you know, that needs to be dealt with to get this document done, and how can the chairs and the rest of the community help? Would it be helpful to have early reviews from some of the other directorates, which I recognize you may not know all of the ones that are available and things like that, but where do you think the document needs the most review from, or what, you know, subjects within it are?
Yeah, I think if I had to say, hey, Corey, you know, Ori has a weekend off, and what is he going to do? Oh, he needs to read my drafts. So I would say to Ori, you know, this core draft, everything before section 5 needs review, because section 5 or 6 onwards is essentially the handshake, right? So probably ignoring appendix. I think we heard from Ori today, drop the appendix, don't talk about APIs, but yeah, and the front matter is, you know, for example, we've got this question: is it SATP SAT / blah blah blah, or is it SATP / blah blah blah? Right. So,
Hi, Ori Steele. Since you've pointed at your area director in the meeting, I was going to ask, maybe we can poll the room who's read this document and provided comments on the list.
That's a good question. I'm going to do that virtual. We have a lot of virtual participants in this group in general, so.
Yep. Virtually as well.
And people in the room, don't hide behind a chair in front of you. Stand up, put your hands up.
Ori, do you want me to do both documents as a group? Or one at a time?
Well, that's sort of the problem you've just uncovered, right?
Yes.
So I'd like to do the documents one at a time. I'd
Okay.
like to get a sense as to the people who are here and who are remote, how many people have read each document fully at least once recently, and how many have provided comments on the list that authors could address.
All right, so for those newer to the IETF, there is a show of hands tool in your either the online version on your phone or on and the full desktop version where you can click yes or no so that we can get a sense of, and what I asked about first was the architecture document. Who has fully read the architecture document, at least somewhat recently, which is the first of Ori's questions. And chairs and authors, you're allowed to answer too.
For those who say no, be careful. It's going to be homework for you guys.
Yeah, it's not a requirement that everybody in the room have them read them. What the real goal here, I hate to speak for our area director, is to make sure that there's at least enough people that it's gotten, a decent review, not that there's everybody. The percentage doesn't matter as much as the total yes count. All right, I don't see the total number ticking up too much anymore. Give it another 30 seconds. All right, so it looks like about 10 people have read it at least recently. So let me switch and then so the new poll is about the core document, about who has read the core document at least somewhat recently. And we'll say recently is probably like in the last year, right? It hasn't morphed extensively. But. All right, looks like we're settling somewhere near 8-ish. I know Thomas doesn't have his phone out, so I think I'll count him as another one. So thank you. And Ori, I think with respect to commenting on the list, that's in the archives, so I don't think that we need to do a show of hands tool. The archives would be more authoritative. So, but all right, thank you very much. With that, any other discussion about the core document? I know that there has also been a couple of implementations of it for that matter too, which is always a promising sign. I don't know how many we're up to. I think 2 or 3. Right?
At least 2. So there's, I don't know if, Rama is online. I don't know if Raphael has got an implementation. He goes online. And I know there's a private productized version from Quant that's not open source. I don't know, but parts of it might be open source. So it's 2 open source plus 1 private, like.
Yeah, and there's been a couple of proof of concepts trying to use it for a particular use case as well. I will encourage, especially those that have implemented it, if you went through and you're guessing at what the intent was, or you're filling in the blanks where things that you were doing. If you were making interpretations, those types of notes really need to go to the working group as, in order to implement this, I made these assumptions based on what I was reading, because that's where clarity is absolutely needed. At some point, it's been a long time since I participated in an interoperability test, but the IETF used to be very much about actually holding interoperability events to prove every implementation implemented different pieces of the protocol and things like that. We haven't done that as much in the last decade, but there was a point where that was actually almost required in the history past. But, okay, if nothing else for core, Claire, go ahead.
I was going to say, I'll take an action on that. We've got an intern at the moment at Quant who's doing their own implementation of SATP, so I'll catch up with them separately and ask them how they found the documentation. They may be slightly biased as they're working with Luke, so but it would be good to get their feedback.
And that would be fantastic. Thank you. All right. So with that, I think we'll go on to the use cases document with Rama. Let me share your slides, or you can actually, you want to request slide sharing, Rama? It's your call.
No, you can share them. I think it'll be easier. On the topic of implementations, one of the implementations that Thomas is referring to, we talked about it in the last SATP working group meeting. That was, I think, in IETF 118. So if people have not seen that presentation, you can go and check it out there. Okay, so yeah, can you move to the next slide, please? So this is just a recap of slide I've presented in the past. If you read the architecture draft, you see that right at the beginning we defined 3 different kind of interoperation modes. Interoperation modes refer to the different ways in which 2 separate networks or 2 separate systems which are maintaining digital assets may need to work with each other in order to fulfill some kind of transaction or a business workflow that spans both of them. So the one that we are handling right now, which is in the scope of the SATP charter, is of course asset transfer, which is right at the top. But there are also other modes that we have defined called asset exchange and data sharing. Asset exchange does not require an asset to actually move from one network to another, but it still requires exchange of assets happening atomically in 2 separate networks. Data sharing is about communicating state in one network to another. So if 2 networks are running business processes that are interlinked in the real world, they may need to know what's going on in the business process in a different network. So at that point, you need to know, we need a protocol whereby one network can query another network and find out some information, and then verify that the information is actually authentically sourced from the network they're requesting. The logic of this classification is indicated at the right, where you see it's if you think of these systems as glorified databases, the asset transfers and asset exchanges are involve atomic operations. That is, they're bidirectional dependencies where there's some state change happening in both networks that had to happen simultaneously for the integration of the transaction. Whereas the data sharing or the data transfer is where you read state from one network and that triggers some kind of state update in another network. These are speaking in very generic terms. So the use cases draft, what we're trying to do is we're trying to exemplify various combinations of these operations in practical scenarios, so that we can show everybody that there is a compelling need for these. And there's, by the way, also several examples of such that of these interoperability modes that have actually been experimented with in the real world. Like the next slide will show one of them. Can you move on to the next slide?
Yeah, can I interrupt you for one question?
Yeah, sure.
So one of the early use cases that was heavily discussed and desired and declared out of scope in the beginning was the bill of lading. That's your 3rd example here. Is that, am I reading that right?
So the bill of lading example is it's not the way the use cases draft talks about it is it refers to it as being either you can either share a bill of lading using a data sharing, which is of course out of scope, but you can also think of the bill of lading as being a digital asset which needs to be moved from one network to another. And if you do that, then you will need SATP code.
Okay, thank you.
So the additions that have been made since IETF 117, that was exactly a year ago, and there were new and compelling use cases that were suggested by Zainan Victor Zhao and Dr. Peter Liu, who I think is in the audience here. And there were several discussions in the SATP mailing list from in the latter part of last year until early this year. So we ended up adding 3 new use cases. 2 of those use cases cover the existing interoperability modes that I talked about in the previous slide, and they slot into broad application areas that we had already defined in the use cases draft prior to IETF 117. But we still added these use cases because they illustrate new scenarios that show that SATP, the SATP core protocol, as well as the SATP architecture, broadly speaking, is really necessary for and compelling in other scenarios besides the ones that we've already talked about. There was a third use case that actually is somewhat different from the other use cases we had already covered before, but it's a kind of use case that prompts thinking about how existing internet protocols can be augmented with more trust by using distributed ledgers, and it showcases future possibilities, whereas these protocols can be made more trustworthy. So SATP, if in the future, if people desire to modify the existing protocols, then they can leverage protocols like SATP for that. So I'll mention that again 2 slides from now. Next slide, this. So just covering the various sections. So each section from 3 up to 6 covers broadly a different field of application. Section 3 covers the area of international trade and supply chains, and for almost the past decade, there's been a lot of work going on that's happened in the field, in the real world, in building networks that specialize in different parts of supply chains or different parts of international trade, such as one network just comprises of participants that are running a trade finance contract, whereas a different network just manages supply chain logistics. A different network manages just KYC and so on. So there are use cases there we've talked about which need SATP and the SATP core, as well as other kinds of modes, SATP modes, in order to enable those networks to interoperate, to be able to share data, to be able to move assets across each other. There's no changes there. Section 4, we're talking about decentralized finance and central bank digital currency, which is a really big topic, which is sort of dominating the blockchain and distributed ledger world these days. And there's been a lot of talk about interoperability because it's really a core requirement. Again, as in the trade and supply chains case, you have here networks that specialize in something particular. Like in the CBDC case, you have networks that just manage wholesale CBDC and other networks that just manage retail CBDC. So not going to go into details, but if you look at the draft, you'll find some definitions and links. And decentralized finance involves other networks which specialize purely in managing particular financial instruments like securities. So if you want, for example, to be able to transfer securities from one network to another, or you want to be able to do a delivery versus payment of securities in one network in exchange for some central bank currency in another network, you will need a protocol either like SATP core or something which is an offshoot of that. And at the bottom left, you see there's an example of something that we actually implemented about 3 years ago. This is part of an experiment conducted exploring the possibility for a digital euro, and this was built by us in the IBM team from folks from IBM Research developed a proof of concept for the Bank of France and for HSBC, who each had a network managing digital assets. One of them was running a ledger technology called Hyperledger Fabric. Another was running a ledger technology called Corda, and we used what is then called the Weaver interoperability tool, but which is now part of Hyperledger Cacti. We'll be using that to either move assets or exchange assets or to share ledger state with each other. So there are links there if people want to examine them later. To this section, to section 4, we've added another example that illustrates how a stock options contract can be fulfilled using SATP. And there, what we are doing is we are linking networks that specialize in managing stock option contracts, and another network that specializes in doing payments. We want a coordinated action across the two. So that's the use case you added there. Next slide, please. So in section 5, we were talking about, generally speaking, decentralized commerce. That is commerce in various tokenized assets happening in a decentralized manner. And that, of course, uses different networks. It relies on different networks running either blockchains or distributed ledger technologies of other kinds. And the goal of such decentralized commerce, very broadly speaking, is you want to be able to sell and obtain payment for goods that are tokenized, goods and services that are tokenized across these kinds of networks. So some of these networks just manage content, some other networks that manage just the payment. Potentially, you can think of designing a system, if you're doing from scratch, which manage all of these things. But in reality, what we've seen happening over the past decade is that you have several networks which do specialize in particular areas, and they specialize in managing particular kinds of digital assets. They want to have a closed group of members. They don't necessarily want to be completely open like the Ethereum main network, and that's why we actually need these protocols like SATP to ensure that they can interoperate. And in this section, we added one example whereby you can think of a networks that manage streaming content, like the kind of content that Netflix or IPTV offer, and there are other networks that manage payments, which I've already talked about. And you may want to be able to move the copyright for content from one network to another, which will be a direct application of SATP core, or you may want to also do payment settlements or a delivery of content versus payment across two different systems, which would require an atomic exchange happening across both. At the right, you see we added a separate, a new section, and this is referring to the last use case that I alluded to a couple of slides ago, where if you think about existing internet protocols, there may be ways to augment their levels of trust in the more decentralized internet that a lot of people think is emerging. And what we can do as an example is think of the DNS protocol and its associated EPP protocol, which enables resource records to be moved from one registrar to another. So if you have owners of particular resources, like second-level domain names, those second-level domain names can be tokenized or monetized, and they can be maintained in different distributed ledger networks. What are these networks comprised of? These networks could be could have as their members different registrars like Squarespace or GoDaddy, as well as top-level domain registries like VeriSign, and they could be running smart contracts which maintain the authentic copies of those resource records. And the clients of those networks would be the registrants who actually end up owning the SLDs. What SATP can do here is if we have a world where different registrars, you have, let's say, a much broader based registrar ecosystem where you have lots of different registrars, some of whom may not be reputed, and you want to be able to move resource record between two different registrars that don't necessarily trust each other, then what's the kind of protocol we can use? SATP in this kind of scenario allows two registrars which belong to different networks to be able to communicate the fact that they or rather if they're running an EPP instance, they may intend to move transfer a resource record from one to the other, but then the tokenized form of that resource record, if it can also be migrated using SATP from one network to another, assuming the two registrars belong to two different networks, then that provides assurance as well as auditability for that particular transactions to happen in case those registrars happen to be unreliable. So this is in this example also kind of illustrates the fact that stage 0, which Thomas talked about earlier, which is out of scope of the SATP protocol, is really the place where you can fit in a lot of existing protocols which create a transaction context. And once the transaction context is created, and the transaction context is really an intent to transfer, once that is created, the SATP core protocol, which really covers stages 1, 2, 3, 4, or 1, 2, 3, that is just executing that particular intent. So this kind of example illustrates how an existing protocol can have its trust augmented with DLTs as well as SATP. So yeah, I think I'm done. Last slide is just QA slide.
All right. Thank you very much, Roma. Any questions about the use case document? Anthony, please.
Hi, I'm Anthony Culligan, one of the
Little
more
closer
recent.
to the mic.
Sorry, Anthony Culligan, one of the more recent contributors. First of all, I think the team is doing a fantastic job on this. But just to give you some context of where I'm coming from, I'm from the world of traditional sort of finance, and we're involved with orchestrating transactions between ledgers. And those ledgers are not, in fact, very rarely are they DLT or blockchain ledgers. And I think it's telling that within the sort of core sort of documents, not the core document, but the sort of constitution of the group, it studiously avoids the idea that this is a protocol limited to blockchain or DLT ledgers. And whereas a lot of the use cases sort of do, express, that this is a DLT thing like Corda to Fabric or something, but the vast majority of use cases that I see that are appropriate here are really in the more traditional areas where finance companies and banks already need, what they need is a shared understanding of a transaction which is going to affect two ledgers. And it's a high likelihood that those ledgers are not going to be DLT ledgers in the vast majority of cases. And then they also need to have a shared state in some circumstances. So shared understanding of a transaction as it goes through, which is what SATP provides, and then a shared state of what those two networks have in terms of their, if you like, the data that's in those networks. So a bank, for example, will record a Nostro account in one ledger and a Vostro account in another ledger. That's probably the most common shared state in financial services. And so I would just offer one bit of advice that within the use case document, get more use cases, and I'm happy to obviously to contribute to this, more use cases which don't focus on the DLT blockchain layer, but look at this area where you have a lot of, the vast majority of cases go through. I'm really encouraged by the work that's been done. I can think, and I can see, because working on the other side, I can see a demand for this kind of protocol. So that's sort of where I'm going, and I'm hoping to contribute some use cases there before we go final on the document.
So I think you've answered my question, Anthony, but as a chair, I'd be remiss if I didn't say you're willing to contribute text, right?
No, I know how to type. Yeah. I will contribute text, absolutely. So
Yeah, I mean, so I agree absolutely. I think we have always, since the beginning, chartering and even discussions, tried to make it ledger agnostic in terms of the types of things that we wanted to support. And so you're 100% spot on. And the problem is the newer ideas that everybody is talking about are, distributed ledgers and other things. But it absolutely, if we could get some more examples in the document for traditional mechanisms that would be augmented, by
Yeah,
this.
I would also shy away from them being called traditional or
Fair.
legacy, because in fact, there's a huge amount of innovation going into cloud-based ledgers, like, Thought Machine, Pismo. I don't want to sort of go through a list, but basically, the big move that banks are making at the moment is not moving from traditional to DLT ledgers. Obviously, a lot of them are doing research there. They're moving from on-premise old-style ledgers to cloud-based ledgers, and this is a huge opportunity for something like SATP to step into that space of being able to be the integrating layer and the decentralized mechanism between these cloud-based ledgers. I mean, I think it's a massive opportunity, and I will contribute text, but fantastic work that the committee's doing, and I can see some real use cases emerging as it gets more mature.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony.
Liang?
Okay, Liang Xia from Huawei. I think my question is still related with how to understand the secure asset transport protocol. And based on these typical use cases, have you identified any security challenges or gaps for the existing protocols that we need to do, to define the new protocol to solve this problem? Or generally speaking, we just use existing protocol like the TLS or IPsec. We can solve all the security problems for these use cases. You know what I mean? I want to know what the security mean here. Security.
Yeah. So Thomas alluded to this a little earlier. I think if we think just about the asset transfer protocol, the security part there is really just ensuring the end-to-end atomicity. That is the integrity of the transfer. So you cannot have a situation where you end up burning an asset in one system and it fails to get recreated in another, or you cannot have a situation where that asset gets replicated in both systems because it was unable to be deleted in the first system. So that is really what the security challenge we're talking about. For the lower level security mechanisms, like when it comes to confidential communication between the gateways, we are relying on systems like or existing protocols like TLS. But when it comes to ensuring that gateways are available and there is this failover, which is you can think of as a reliability issue really. There are drafts there in the SATP page. If you can take a look. Sorry, Thomas. I think you're trying to say something.
So in fact, we had a whole discussion about on the mailing list and the interim meeting about threats to what happens. So so it's not about the communication security. Maybe I misunderstood you, but things like, well, what happens if gateway 1 is cheating or gateway 2 is cheating? Cheating here means that gateway 1 proceeds with all the transaction, and at the last sort of pre-commitment stage, which is I think flow 3.4, it aborts, right? It aborts the transaction and it basically goes silent. What that does, it can exhaust the resources at gateway 2 because gateway 2 is already doing some pre-commitment stage, right? So we have not gotten a separate threats assessment document, though we've been asked about that, and we kind of default answer is it's out of scope. We have some text at the end of I think it's core that talks about some of the threats issues, but yeah, we in the mailing list we talk about this. That's so following from what Rama is saying, our notion of security means, do we satisfy the 4 ACID properties: atomicity, consistency, isolation, and durability, right? Okay. And so what what bad things can the gateways do basically to cheat the other guy to break the asset properties, right? This is open if you want to contribute to doing that. If you want to sign up to a draft doing threat analysis, you're most welcome, because we need something like that. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think this is a very interesting thing. So I just want to learn more about,
Yeah.
how to understand what you are doing now here. So, I think you answer part of my confusion. Thank you. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Peter?
Hi, Peter Liu from Huawei as well. So the reason, because I kind of proposed the pay-as-you-watch use case and the other the exercise of options contracts. So I just want to give a little bit more additional information about pay-as-you-watch use case, because like right now in China the operators are trying to build national wide overlay networks that support data exchange and transactions. So right now, this is the operators are trying to invest this kind of overlay to support how to assetization of data in chunks or in capsules. So the wide area transmission of those data between campus to campus or campus to DC, the payment will be or the transaction should be be performed at the same time as the data being wide area transmitted. So this is like additional information, like there will be more practice this use case of pay as you watch it. So the point idea of that use case is trying to make sure like the wide area transmission of data and the payment are actually taking place at the same time. And so these two channels could be synchronized. So just a little bit more information about like there will be more practice on implementation of this kind of use case. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for proposing those use cases. Yeah, if you can, just on the mailing list, if you can share any links about what you just said, that'd be great. We can add it to the document.
Trick is mostly will be Chinese in
Okay.
Chinese, but I will find some. Yeah, definitely. I can send anything useful.
All right,
Thank you.
thank you, Peter. So Rama, my same questions are going to fall to you. Where do you think we are, document-wise? It sounds like you're going to get some more text from a couple of people, which is fantastic. But otherwise, do you feel the document's in good shape and about ready for like a working group last call once you get the additional pieces in place?
Yeah, Thomas and I had a discussion on this about a month ago, and we thought it was kind of ready. We'll let's get Anthony's use cases in, and there's also a message I saw yesterday from Martin Geller, and I'll respond to that as well. I think his main question was whether these use cases cover more than SATP core. The answer is yes. They basically cover different applications of the SATP architecture really, and they're not just limited to the SATP core protocol. But we felt it's good to have use cases that just show how the general interoperability among different systems that are managing digital assets is really a sore point, and we need SATP core as well as future protocols derived from the SATP architecture. About the dates, as soon as Anthony's offers some additional text, I think we can probably open it up for um, for the same thing we did to the architecture. Sorry, I'm not well versed in the IETF terminology, but we can open it up for review, I guess, at that point.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. I'll preface that use case documents in the IETF do not necessarily mean these problems are solved exclusively with this technology, right? It's that the SATP architecture and protocol can be used to solve a bigger problem that may need other pieces. So that is just fine. Just in the use case, try and clearly spell out where SATP sort of comes into play and the roles that it fills. Go ahead, Thomas. Is there a page limit? Certain area directors get very grumpy at 300-page documents, yes. Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good question. So Thomas asked about, succinctness, and we don't like to be overly verbose. We tend to prefer short and concise documents without going into great limits. That being said, I think I have a record for one of the longest IETF documents ever written, and I apologize to everybody that had to review it. But Ori.
Hi, Ori Steele. There isn't a page limit per se, but if your use cases, if several of them that are nearly indistinguishable from each other, I don't think that's helpful in a use cases document. So I think when you develop your use cases documents, you want each use case to cover an interesting area where the protocol is relevant. It's maybe not the only way to solve that problem space, but each use case that you describe should be concisely described and distinct. And you want to avoid many use cases that are essentially saying the same thing. I will not enjoy reading that. No one else will either. So focus your document on clear, distinct use cases, and avoid repetitive use cases that are, essentially indistinguishable from each other, but, switching out a few pieces. That's it.
Yeah, thanks. Another way to say that
Thank
would be, we want example use cases, not an enumeration of all use cases. All right. Thank you, Rama. Anything else from you? All right.
No, nothing else.
Then let's go to Dennis, who I think is online. Dennis, we didn't get slides from you, so we don't know if you just want to talk or.
Yes, hello. Hello, everyone. Yeah, I sent you, I just wanted to show the stage 0 diagram, which is online. There is a URL, so I don't know where I can show. I can share screen.
Screen, or I can.
So I sent you the URL. It was a private message before. So it's stage 0.
Okay. Give me a minute, Becky. Go ahead.
It's an internet draft that is available on the SATP documents. So just to connect with what we discussed before, in SATP core, we're dealing with the strict interoperability or interchange between Gateway 1 and Gateway 2. So there is that's the only diagram that I would like to discuss a bit here. However, I mean, if we see the architecture and the overall approach of SATP, there are 6 entities that need somehow to coordinate. It's the application 1 with the network 1 and gateway 1, and on the other side, this application 2 with gateway 2 and network 2. So the whole discussion about how do we prepare SATP to run is about how do we establish what we said before as the transfer context between these 6 entities, basically. So although stage 0 is outside the scope of SATP, the idea here is to capture what should happen before the 3-phase of the SATP protocol. So as we see here, the intent of stage 0 is, first of all, and I will go through the diagrams. As you see, after number 9, there is the SATP core execution, so where it's the SATP core comes into play. But before, what stage 0 is about is to, first of all, from the application side, the intent is to transfer, for example, an asset from Alice to Bob in application 2. So the idea here is to, from the application, to go to the gateway, establish a transfer context, make this context known to network 1. Typically, if we would like to have competition over transfers in assets from different gateways that want to eventually lock and transfer the same asset, there should be some sort of binding between the specific transfer context and the assets inside the network. Therefore, the network should have notion of what is the transfer context that is requesting the transfer of these assets. So there is this binding, number one, and there is the request of the transfer context from application to gateway one, and then there is the binding of the assets in network one. And then there is the application to application communication, which is the propagation of this transfer context from application one to application two. From that moment on, the application 2 knows about the transfer, and there is the same thing about binding the transfer context to the specific network 2 assets, and then propagate the transfer context in gateway 2. And then there is the binding between gateway 2 and gateway 1, which is around number 8 there. From that moment on, all the 6 entities have established the relevant connections. So then SATP can trigger, and that's number 9. And then we have the execution of SATP, and at the end we can have whatever is, the completion is, rollback or commit, and we can actually fetch the result in from 10 to number 13. So as we see here, one of the core elements of this whole transfer is the context. So Wes, if you can go a little bit down, further down in the annex, there is an example of what a transfer context could be. And as you could see, the JSON example here, there are all sorts of things like network IDs, gateways IDs, asset IDs as well. So we can refer to the assets in the different networks. So we can semantically understand what the different assets are, like the example Thomas took on the MICA, the AFR, AEMT. So here it's a definition of all the things that should be immutable and should stay there for the whole execution of SATP. So that's, in a nutshell. I don't want to say more. I mean, I prefer to answer to questions, but just to relate to what we discussed, stage 0 is something that, establishes this context of information about all the 6 entities that are participating in SATP. And in the transfer context, it's a data structure, a complex data structure with a unique immutable ID that points to the different things that are necessary for these 6 entities to interoperate.
All right, thanks for the good description. That makes clear sense to me. Does anybody have questions or comments for Dennis? David?
Yes, I was just wondering on the flow diagram on step 4, how does that message get from app 1 to app 2?
So this is typically something that is between applications. So if Alice wants to transfer to Bob, there should be some way of reaching Bob and saying, here is the intent to transfer some assets from me to you, or Bob requests to Alice and say, I would like to receive these assets. So there should be some sort of application to application communication there somehow, which is not specified in stage 0.
Oh, okay. So we're going to leave that undefined.
Well, there should be the application level, communications there. This could vary. Could be, from any sort of communication between applications. The only thing that actually we are somehow defining here is the kind of data should flow from application 1 to application 2. Now, the protocol and the way that this thing happens, it's something that it's still outside the scope of stage 0.
Okay.
From a working group perspective, we are trying to charter pieces that then can be used as the core transfer, and other things can be agreed upon out of time or earlier, or through whether they're in interoperability mechanisms or not, as long as they've come to the agreement that the core protocol can actually make use and execute that transfer. And it may be in the future we want to standardize a common way to do it, but it's not actually required to be interoperable. Is that fair, Dennis?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. Anthony?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. Firstly, I think this context is really important, and I know that you've been told we shouldn't do things which are out of scope. But when we don't have to look too far ahead to see that certain transactions are going to be interdependent. So I think Thomas gave an example of a delivery versus payment, where you want those two separate SATP transactions to be dependent on each other. So the context is the way that we are going to, I think, in the future, link individual SATP components together. And I think it's good to think about that now. And I think Dennis has done a great job in sort of putting forward some drafts of what it might look like. And then the second point is typically the parties, so App 1 and App 2, will get to know about transactions through something which is out of bounds. So in say, finance, where I'm working, you might have an exchange which basically says, okay, party A and party B have both agreed to, sell this token or this share for this amount of money. That is then communicated separately to App 1 and App 2 by the exchange, so that when you go to the settlement process of saying, okay, let's now execute this transaction, those two apps will already know about that through having it being communicated from an agreed transaction on an exchange. So I just thought that might be useful to mention that.
And there is maybe one thing that another one that we should put in the picture is the fact that besides the semantics of what we are transferring, there is also some technical challenges that we have to address. Typically, if we have a locking of assets for one SATP transfer instance, that might be like a pessimistic locking databases. I mean, we take a hard lock on the and if this transfer fails, I mean, we have to release the assets. But there might be other like more optimistic ways of approaching. So you can have many concurrent gateway claims to transfer assets in the same assets in the network. So by having this transfer context, we can mention and point to the different transfers. So if one succeeds, the other would fail, and the network should know about that and which gateways are in concurrency for the transfer of specific assets. Maybe it's too early to discuss about that, but the fact that we have a transfer context might allow us to more easily address these kind of challenges.
All right, thank you, Ned.
Ned Smith, Intel. I wonder if you can give me some intuition about what it means to bind assets to a network. I think I understand, or I can get my arms around the idea of binding an application to an endpoint, a single endpoint. What does it mean to bind to?
Typically, there is some sort of state that there should be, in the life cycle of assets, like a reserved for a specific transfer. So if the network knows about the transfer context, it can, set somehow the list eventually of transfers that actually are concurrently accessing the specific assets in the network. So there is sort of a life cycle of the asset inside the network, somehow implicit to all of these. So somebody requested to transfer the asset. There is one of the gateways that succeed to transfer it, and then eventually the asset is moved. So if it is a DLT behind, then we have to burn or extinguish the asset somehow, or even if the database, then we should put a pointer on the asset transfer to the remote network. So this notion of binding is the fact that inside a transfer, the specific asset is related to the specific transfer context. So we can trace what happened even later on when the completion of the protocol is performed. So if it is rolled back or committed, so we can trace eventually the assets.
Can I jump in also, Ned? So there's this problem. We say bind, maybe it's the non-traditional use of bind, but when you have a bunch of assets that's all lined up to be part of a context, there must be a way somehow for the network to know, don't allow anything else to happen to this. And we've been saying lock so far without saying how to actually do the lock. So applications can't do a lock because the lock is kind of a network function. So we've been using the word bind. We might end up finding some other word, but I know what you mean. Typically we say application bind to an endpoint. Yeah. So
if I might follow up what Thomas said, I mean, if we go back to the traditional database, it's a lock intention here, the binding.
I think the term network is throwing me off a bit. I think of the network as, you know, like a, you know, IP is a network.
Yeah.
But certainly a collection of nodes you know, can be a network. It seems like it's a little bit, you know, higher level abstraction.
Yeah. Chair hat on here. One thing that we agreed to over a year ago is to try and call it an asset network, because it's not. And, you know, unfortunately, we're in the IETF, and anytime somebody hears the word network, and we saw that in some of the reviews that we got from the security directorate and stuff, that they were confused as you're not alone there, and that's our fault. I think anywhere in the documents that we say network, we really need to say asset network to make sure that readers understand the context. And I think we need to fix that in all the documents.
Yeah, which is closer semantically to the concept of a system, basically. So something that is managing the assets. So of course, if it is a DLT, there is a network that is, you know, the virtual machine is all you know, committing at the same time. So the network and the system is the same thing. But if we are a more traditional setting, it could be a you know, 3-tier regular application there as a network.
All right, thank you, Dennis. Anything else from you, or anybody else have comments for Dennis?
Thank you.
All right, that brings us actually to the end of the agenda, and we actually went over the hour and a half, so I'm glad we got the 2-hour limit, even though we only went over by 6 minutes. There is a slot for any other business, so if anybody else has things you want to bring up or discuss, now is the time, but otherwise we will wrap up. It's been a good discussion today. I will, Claire?
I just wanted to second that and say it's really good to see a meeting so involved and with so many people willing to share their thoughts and opinions. So I wanted to thank everyone for taking part.
Yeah. One other comment. It's sort of rare that IETF working groups get into news articles, and this working group has gotten into multiple news articles. So get it right, people, because because it's important. So yeah, so you know, it's actually you know, the world's eyes are actually on us to sort of push sort of through the next phase of getting some interoperability and digital asset transfers, and that's actually a really good thing. But it's been interesting to see them pop up in real world news articles. So well done, Ori.
Ori Steele. I just want to say, you know, thank you to the chairs for running a successful session. Thank you to all the working group participants who've engaged on the list and are remote and who are here in room. Remember to follow your charter as you work on your documents. The sooner, the more precisely you follow your charter and you complete these documents without creating connections to other stuff, that'll help progress the documents, and that'll make the opportunity for considering a rechartering more likely in the future. So staying within charter is the key to having a next charter. And I look forward to helping you work on these documents. And thank you again to Wes and Claire and all the authors for your hard work. It's excellent to see the progress you've made. Thank you.
Yeah, following on, this group is unique in that many other participants are not seasoned IETF experts, and you've all figured out how to wade through this process, and I recognize that it's not trivial. So, thank you for figuring out how this whole system works. It's a learning experience. So. All right, with that, I don't see anything else. So thank you, Claire, for hanging in, and thank you, everybody remote, and thank you to all the participants in the room. And we will see you in Dublin, hopefully, for those that can make it there. And actually, one other thought. We too typically hold interim meetings. This group is very active in between. My guess is Claire and I will work through it, but my guess is we'll probably do an interim in a month or so. That's been our typical frequency. And we'll get back to you and post an announcement to that on the list after getting approval from Ori for doing that. Okay, thanks.